Every small town has its local legend, but ours was about the 11:33 night train, a passenger line that supposedly derailed decades ago during a storm. According to the stories, some nights it still passes through, though the tracks were torn up long ago. I never believed any of it. I'm a night shift security guard at the old freight yard, and urban legends don't pay the bills. But one foggy November night, the yard lights cut out for the first time in years. The silence was heavy, almost electric. Then I heard the distant echo of a whistle. At first I thought it was a trick of the wind, but the sound grew louder, rhythmic, metal grinding metal. The ground trembled, and then, through the fog, I saw lights of full passenger train, lanterns glowing gold. It rolled straight through the yard on rails that no longer existed. I could see people inside, or shadows that looked like people sitting perfectly still. Their faces pale, their eyes unfocused, like they were waiting for something that would never come. The train slowed, hissing steam, and for a moment, I thought it might stop. A door slid open, and a man in an old conductor's uniform leaned out. He didn't speak, just tilted his head, as if inviting me aboard. Then, just as suddenly, the lights blinked out. The train dissolved into fog. The night returned to normal except for a thin layer of frost left on the ground where the tracks used to be. The next morning, I mentioned it to one of the older yard hands. He just stared at me and said, "You're lucky you didn't step closer. The ones who do, they say the train stops for them." I haven't worked a night shift since, but every now and then, just before midnight, I still hear that whistle, faint, distant, calling someone else instead. Stay tuned for the next ghostly encounter. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel.
I used to work maintenance for an old downtown apartment complex, one of those pre-war buildings with high ceilings, rattling radiators, and a smell of dust that never quite left the air. My job was mostly patchwork, repairs, but sometimes tenants called about things stranger than leaks. One morning, a new resident, for B, said she'd been hearing voices through her wall. I went to check the adjoining unit 4A, but the key I had didn't fit. When I looked at the building schematics, there was no 4A. The numbers skipped from 3B straight to 4B. I thought it was an error until I followed the corridor past 4B. At the far end, half hidden behind an old radiator pipe, was a door painted over the same color as the wall. I chipped away the paint, turned the knob, and stepped inside. It was a single room, perfectly square. No windows, no furniture, just peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of something sweet, like rotting flowers. The light from my phone flickered as if the air itself were thicker. There, on the far wall, I saw indentations, shallow, repeated marks, almost like someone had been clawing to get out. And on the floor, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "I hear them too." When I came back with the property manager, the door was gone. Just smooth plaster where it had been. He swore there was never an extra unit. But that night, when I passed the hallway, I heard faint knocking, steady, slow, and coming from inside the wall. The next day, 4B moved out without a word. She left the door wide open, and on the inside of it, scratched faintly near the bottom, was a message. I didn't notice at first. "If you find the room again, don't go in." I still dream about that square room. And sometimes, when I wake, I swear I can still smell those flowers. Stay tuned for the next ghostly encounter.
There's an old one-lane bridge outside my hometown, rusted steel, half-sunk posts, a narrow path barely wide enough for one car. Clover Creek Bridge. Locals used to say if you stopped on it at midnight and turned your engine off, you could hear the water whisper your name. I didn't believe in that kind of thing until last summer. I was driving home from a late shift, fog rolling low, when I saw flashing hazards ahead. A car was parked in the middle of the bridge, door hanging open. I slowed down, expecting someone nearby, but the car was empty. No driver, no footprints, just the faint sound of running water below. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't leave it there. I leaned inside, found the keys still in the ignition, radio humming, faint static. Then a voice came through the static, soft, "Female, please help me." I jerked back, heart racing. The voice came again, this time clearer. "Please, I'm in the water." I ran to the edge, peered over. The fog shifted, and I saw her a pale shape half submerged, long hair fanning out on the current. I shouted and climbed down, slipping on the rocks. But when I reached a spot, there was nothing, just the sound of the stream, cold and steady. When I looked up, her car headlights flickered then shut off. The next morning, I told the sheriff. He went pale when I mentioned the name on the car's registration. That was Emily Wren, he said quietly. She went missing 3 years ago, last seen driving across that bridge. They pulled her car out of the creek that same week back then nobody ever found. That night, I drove out there again, parked before the bridge. I turned the radio on, let the static fill the silence. Then faintly, like a breath over glass, I heard her again. You shouldn't have come back. Stay tuned for the next ghostly encounter. When I moved into the basement suite of that old duplex, I thought I'd lucked out. Cheap rent, private entrance, and just enough space for one person trying to start over. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargreaves, lived upstairs. She was kind but seemed oddly insistent that I never move the mirror in the hallway. It was tall, antique, framed in black walnut with specks of silvering along the edges. I didn't think much of it until one night, I came home late and caught a flicker in its glass like someone stepping out of sight. I blamed exhaustion. A week later, I started hearing faint movements around the footsteps dragging slowly across the laminate floor, always stopping right behind me. I turned, and nothing. Once, while brushing my teeth, I saw a hand on my shoulder in the reflection, pale, slightly trembling. I spun around. Empty room. Mrs. Hargreaves avoided my questions. She'd just say, "That mirror belonged to my son. It stays where it is." I didn't press further. One night, I woke to a noise like glass cracking. I stumbled into the hall and froze. The mirror's surface was rippling, like something beneath it was moving through liquid. And within that distortion, a face surfaced, a man's face, sunken-eyed, lips blue. He mouthed words I couldn't hear. Then his hand pressed against the inside of the mirror, leaving a fog print that spread like breath on glass. I ran to Mrs. Hargreaves' door, pounding until she opened it. She looked down at me, eyes wet. "You saw him, didn't you?" she whispered. "He doesn't know he's gone. That's why I can't move the mirror. If I do, he'll think I left him behind." She walked past me, stroked the glass, and whispered something, maybe his name. The ripples stilled. I moved out the next morning, but before I left, I looked one last time into that mirror. In the reflection, my face stared back, but behind me, just over my shoulder, someone was still standing. Stay tuned for the next ghostly encounter.
I moved into a small, centuries-old row house at the edge of town, thinking the rent was too good to pass up. The previous tenant had left suddenly, leaving a stack of bills and an old, dust-covered journal behind. At first, everything seemed fine. The creaks and groans of the old wood were charming, almost comforting. But soon, subtle oddities began to creep in. Footsteps echoed across the hallway at night, always slow and deliberate. Though no one was there, the bathroom mirror would sometimes fog up as if someone had just showered. Even when I was the only one home, doors I was sure I'd locked would be slightly ajar in the morning, and objects, utensils, my coffee mug shifted positions on their own. One evening, I woke to a cold draft and a soft whisper calling my name from the kitchen. I froze, straining to hear more. The voice wasn't loud, not commanding, just insistent and eerily familiar. My heart raced, and when I turned on the lights, nothing was there. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept seeing shadows in the corners of my eyes, small movements in the periphery, but whenever I looked directly, the room was empty. A week later, I opened the old journal. Most entries were mundane, but one page caught my attention. Written in careful, looping handwriting was a single sentence repeated over and over. "She watches when you think you're alone." The ink was smudged, almost wet. My chest tightened. That night, I placed a camera in the living room to see what was happening while I slept. The footage didn't show anything unusual, no figure, no movement, nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every time I entered the kitchen, I felt a cold presence brush past me. The whispers became more frequent, always soft, always calling my name. Then came the night I couldn't ignore. I woke to the sound of shuffling across the hallway. I gripped the baseball bat beside my bed and stepped into the hallway. The air was freezing, my breath forming visible clouds. At the end of the hallway, the faint outline of a woman appeared. She was translucent, eyes dark and empty, staring straight at me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. She lifted a hand slowly, pointing toward the old journal on my desk. Terrified, I obeyed. I flipped it open. Pages I hadn't seen before were filled with photographs, portraits of previous tenants, all looking terrified, all with the same wide, empty eyes, and at the bottom of each photo, scrawled in the same looping handwriting, was a single word: Nex. I left the house the next morning and never returned, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear a soft whisper from the shadows, "You're next."